Thank you again for coming. Community Sundays are always a lot of fun. It's great to be able to connect with one another. On this occasion, also right after the service, we're going to have a potluck with soup, and then we'll have our annual meeting where we'll look at back over the past year and our finances and all the sort of business side of church. It's a great family time together, so everybody's welcome to come to that, to stay on afterwards, and there'll be lots of opportunity during the soup luncheon to chat as well. Obviously it's an unusual day. What is that? It's 10:42 now, so we're a little bit later getting into the message than we normally are. So I'll try and keep things brief. So we're in a series called Surprised by Love, looking at the Gospel of Mark in the Christian Scriptures. And this week's section is the best part of 3 chapters. And I was thinking, who the heck decided to include 3 chapters when we've got a service like this? And then I realized, oh, that would be me. I made that decision. So we've got 3 chapters to wade through. We're not going to go into all of it, obviously. But maybe we can just put the first slide up. This is a little overview of this section. Encourage you to get the discussion questions that are available out on the table in the lobby, and also you can download them online, which will sort of get into different aspects of what we're going to talk about today, and will give you an opportunity to sort of explore this passage yourself as well. We're just going to touch on the first bullet and the last bullet in the session today. But first of all, just a quick overview. Lots of stuff going on in this passage. It starts off with Jesus calming a storm. That's a kind of famous story about Jesus. There's one of many of the exorcisms in Mark's Gospel, the exorcism of an individual who has a legion, multiple demons. And there's a sort of significance to that, which we'll touch on. Then there's a resuscitation and a healing. A little girl is brought back to life, and that's told in alongside a story of a woman who received some healing from Jesus. And that's, as Wesley was talking about last week, a classic Markan sandwich, where Mark starts off, or the author of Mark's talking about one thing, cuts to another, and then comes back to the original story. Jesus is rejected by his hometown. He goes back to Nazareth, and they're amazed by him, but they're also kind of put out by him. It's almost like they think he's a bit cocky because he's teaching with authority and he's performing miracles and all this kind of stuff. So he's rejected. And in fact, what we've called today, the title for today is Miracles and Resistance, because throughout Mark, and particularly in this section, we see examples of the great power of Jesus and also the resistance to Jesus. And in this section, the resistance comes from his hometown. We've seen it from religious leaders previously. We've seen it from his own family even previously. And then there's this sense of mystery too about Jesus. The 12, the disciples, the named disciples, are sent out. They still don't really get Jesus. They don't understand Jesus. They don't know really who he is. We've been let in on that secret right at the beginning, but they haven't really worked it out yet. But they go out and they start doing some incredible things like Jesus. So there's this sort of mixture. They're sort of getting it and they're sort of not getting it. There's mystery in all of this. John the Baptist is beheaded in this section, and there's a sort of that creates this sense of foreboding. There's a comment in the text that says his disciples came and laid his body in the tomb, which sort of it's foreshadowing. It's because we know that's what's going to happen to Jesus. So there's some darkness hanging over this section. There's the story that we just heard about in the communion presentation about the loaves and the fishes and the multiplication of the food. Very famous story, full of metaphor, full of symbolism, which we're not even going to touch on one bit today. Jesus then walks on water. Another famous story. And in fact, so there's 8 things. There's some more healings after that, but I couldn't fit it on the slide, so I decided to leave that piece out because we've got 8 bullets on there already. It was getting pretty long, but you get the gist. So there's lots of things happening, and we get here actually, I think, a great example of Mark's style, which is short, sharp stories, back and forth, switching scenes, one thing to another. Which in that day, in the ancient world, that was viewed as a sort of crass way of writing. And so for centuries, Mark's Gospel was kind of looked down upon as not a great piece of literature. Whereas in more modern times, for all sorts of reasons, scholars would actually look at Mark as a brilliant piece of literature. And I think we can probably relate as modern people to that short, sharp chopping and changing of scenes. You think of directors like Quentin Tarantino or Guy Ritchie, those kinds of movies where we're kind of drawn in by that kind of rapidity of scenes. Maybe we're all a little ADD and it helps in that respect, I don't know. But it's brilliant storytelling, I think. Just my opinion. Okay, as I said, we're going to deal with the first bullet and the last bullet. Let's just jump into the text of that first story, Jesus Calms a Storm. Very famous story. It appears in all the synoptic gospels. Here's Mark telling this story, perhaps in writing for the first time. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up. This is on the Sea of Galilee. Okay, so a sea very close to Jesus' home area. And the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Now it's interesting that it says they were terrified. You almost wonder, were they terrified because they thought they were going to drown, or were they terrified because somebody just calmed the waves and performed a pretty amazing miracle? It's perhaps a little ambiguous there. But they asked this question, who is this? And that's the question running throughout Mark. If you remember, we know the answer to that question because the author tells us in verse 1 of chapter 1, it says this: the beginning of the good news, the gospel, the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So we know that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Very few other people in the story know that. They sort of, it gradually dawns on them, or on some of them, but we know from the beginning. So when they ask this question, who is this? We're kind of reminded of who Jesus is. Now it's interesting, I think, that Mark starts the gospel this way: no birth narrative. We mentioned that in the introduction. There's no birth narrative. So we're coming up for the holidays soon. We'll read passages from Matthew and from Luke because they tell the story of Jesus' birth in different ways, actually, with different details. But Mark doesn't see it necessary to talk about the birth of Jesus in that way. And that begs a question, really. I think that sort of sets up a way of thinking about Mark's gospel, because if we compare it to Matthew and Luke are kind of telling us that Jesus is divine because of the way Jesus is born. Jesus is born, you could say, sort of comparable to a lot of the Greco-Roman mythology, where a god and a human have an offspring, and that offspring is divine. You think of someone like Achilles, right, would be an example of that. Aeneas in the Roman context. And so we're sort of, that kind of gets us thinking a little bit of Jesus is obviously divine, we could say, perhaps then. Jesus is special. The challenge of that, I think, is that we tend to think of Jesus like an Achilles-type figure. So, think of Achilles in the Trojan War. Once he starts fighting, it's game over, and because he's got special powers. And we can think of Jesus in that way, that Jesus is really God in a human disguise. And we could forget about the humanity of Jesus. Whereas in Mark's gospel, Jesus is very human, very human. And when there's that voice from heaven that we heard about or read about a few weeks ago that says, "You are my beloved son," and we see here in verse 1, Jesus is the Son of God. That doesn't necessarily tell us that Jesus is divine. I'm not saying Jesus isn't divine. I'm just saying what Mark is saying here. Because the term Son of God was used in the Hebrew scriptures to refer to kings, to various agents that operated on God's behalf, that were sort of favored of God. It was even a term used for the nation of Israel. So it could have very human qualities, that term Son of God. And some theologians, some scholars have wondered, perhaps this is a different form of being the Son of God here. This is like Jesus sort of taking on deity rather than it being sort of pre-existent, Jesus being a human form of pre-existent deity. In other words, when in John's Gospel, when Jesus says, I and the Father are one, there's this sort of unity between the human spirit and the divine spirit. Perhaps this is Jesus taking on that sense of divinity that we all potentially could possess. Because Jesus also says, I pray that you would be one as I am one with the Father and I am one with you. Jesus talked about us being one with God. So as we read these stories, especially in Mark's Gospel, we see Jesus in a very human, sometimes very vulnerable kind of way. But when they ask in this story, who is this? I think Mark here begins to show us the divine life of Jesus. And I want to just sort of show a little bit of that as we unpack it. First of all, if we jump ahead, we're not going to jump ahead right now, but if we go to the final story that we'll look at in a second, it says there that the disciples were confused because they didn't understand about the loaves, that story that we heard about in communion. They didn't understand because the people ate and then they collected up 12 baskets, and that's a symbol of something, and they just didn't get it. So I think what actually we are being told by the author here is that not only are Jesus' teachings, Jesus' parables, symbolic, there's symbolic meaning that we should seek out in those parables. We were hearing about that last week from Wesley. But also, these miracles seem symbolic. They didn't understand the miracle. They didn't understand the symbolism of the miracle. And we're being told these stories a certain way. We're being told these miracles a certain way. I'm not saying miracles didn't happen. I'm just saying that whatever happened, we're being told it in a certain way. And that the way we're being told is somewhat symbolic. So we ought to look for what that means, including in this story of Jesus calming the water, calming the sea, calming the waves. And what we see there, I think, in the story that we just read, is a whole load of emotion, right? There's at least one symbol there that the storm in that story mirrors at least the emotion of the people in the story. The disciples are very emotional, right? They're afraid. They're really afraid. And, some have said it must have been a terrible storm because, these guys were fishermen and they would be used to the kind of storms that you can get on the Sea of Galilee. So this must have been a really, really bad one. But all it says in the text is that the disciples, and it doesn't even say the 12, but the disciples, go with Jesus. Jesus says, let's go to the other side of the lake. And because Jesus has business over there. And so there's presumably people in the boat with Jesus who aren't necessarily fishermen, because not all Jesus' disciples are fishermen. So some of them, I don't know what you're like on a boat when it's rough, but that can be pretty scary. And they're really, really scared. They're also pretty annoyed, right? It's like, Jesus, wake up! What are you doing sleeping in the boat? They kind of express that, I think, anger, annoyance at Jesus. Jesus wakes up, and my reaction on waking up, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation when everybody's running around trying to sort something out or working really hard on a project and you didn't realize, and then you sort of saunter in 5 minutes later or whatever. I would have been like, I'm really sorry. If I'd been Jesus in the boat, I'd have been, sorry, fell asleep there. Yeah, let me sort something out. But actually, Jesus is annoyed. He's kind of like, really? Do you have no faith? Why are you so afraid? And then he's kind of annoyed. There's some anger when it says he rebukes. That's one of Mark's favorite words. He rebukes the wind and the waves and says, peace be still. So there's emotion here. So we can think about this story perhaps in terms of the emotional storms that we get into ourselves, right? Through circumstances, through situations where we get stirred up. And Jesus is speaking peace to this situation. So there's something perhaps there for us, which we'll home in on in a second. There's ways we're being told this story that are, I think, clearly allusions to Hebrew scripture. I'm just going to give us 3 examples of this and sort of try and draw out, okay, so what might some of the symbolism be here? So let's look at the first one. It's in Psalm 89. Who is like you, Lord God Almighty? You are Lord. You, Lord, are mighty, and your faithfulness surrounds you. You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them. You crushed Rahab like one of the slain. With your strong arm, you scattered your enemies. So here is the author of Mark, I think, alluding here perhaps to the sort of divine qualities of Jesus. Because this, I think, alluding to a psalm like this, where this is obviously about God, right? And we also have something here that you crushed Rahab. Rahab was an ancient Mesopotamian sea monster. And for the Hebrew people, the sea, the waves, water, was always viewed as chaotic and fearful. We have that in the first Hebrew creation story, don't we? Where there's the water, and it's symbolic of chaos, and order is brought to that chaos. So for the Hebrew people, the sea was always a sort of fearful, scary thing. And here we have the term Rahab used. Rahab was also a term for Egypt. It was kind of like a slang term for Egypt, a poetic term for Egypt. Egypt, of course, representing enslavement and oppression. And so here we have the sea and chaos symbolized in political aggression, political oppression, and the chaos of that, and the chaos of oppression, if you like. And of course, this story comes before, if you can remember those bullets from earlier, this story comes right before Jesus crosses over the lake. I mean, that's what's happening here, and goes to the other side of the lake, which is the Decapolis, which is a Roman area. And there's a demon-possessed man there who, when Jesus says to the demon, "What's your name?" the response is, "We are legion." You know how you can imagine that in a movie, because there's presumably 100 of them. There's multiple ones, but the fact that that term legion is used is a clear allusion to Roman Empire, to Roman oppression. Jesus is in a Roman area. There's demons called legion, and Jesus triumphs over those demons, casts the demons out of that person. You get this sort of connotation that Jesus is not just calming the waves, but Jesus is bringing peace and order to oppression and violence. Let's look at another scripture, another Psalm, 107. Some went out the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. You can imagine the waves like that, right? In their peril, their courage melted away, a bit like the disciples. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. So we get again this sense of Jesus is sort of playing the role of God here. These would have been familiar psalms, familiar excerpts to the readers, to the listeners of this gospel account. So we're seeing the divine life of Jesus come through. Let's look at another one here, a final one in Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah, writing centuries before Jesus. Awake, awake, arm of the Lord. Okay, they woke Jesus up on the boat. Clothe yourself with strength. Awake as in days gone by, as in generations of old. Was it not you who cut Rahab to pieces, who pierced that monster through? Rahab again. Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made a road in the depths of the sea so that the redeemed might cross over? Those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter into Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will take over them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. We have this quotation talking about that even the fact that we're saying to God, awake, means we think God must be asleep or absent or just not there or not noticing. And this is written in a time of great oppression. Again, the reference there to Rahab, the Egyptian oppression, which was more historical even then for the people of Israel, but symbolic of oppression in general. So here's the prophet saying, wake up, God, help us, deliver us from oppression. And then there's this sort of beautiful future that they're describing that will happen as God acts. And perhaps this is how we feel sometimes, right? Like those disciples in the boat, where it's like, are you going to help us? Do you not see the chaos Do you not see the oppression? Do you not see my own personal situation and what I'm going through? Do you not see the situations plus around the world? And it can feel like God is absent, or if God isn't absent, God's asleep, or it doesn't care. And here's Jesus' response to that. Why do you have such little faith? Right? Which seems a little bit harsh, but it seems that Jesus believes in them. He believes that, you know, I think the implication here is that Jesus would have carried on sleeping. He seemed to imply that you can manage the chaos here. You can bring peace to this chaos. You can bring peace into this situation. And there's Jesus kind of modeling for us this sense of centeredness, sleeping in a boat while the chaos is going around. And we know from previous verses in previous chapters that Jesus is frequently, it mentions this, frequently going off on his own to pray. He's taking time for silence and solitude such that he's able to center himself no matter what the chaos going on around him. And rather than perhaps it being indifference to the disciples, he's actually saying, I want to show you a new way of life. You too can have that centeredness. You can have these divine qualities where you're not overwhelmed by the chaos. You're not overwhelmed by the emotion. You're not overwhelmed by the oppression. You're not overwhelmed by the violence. And you can bring something to that. I wonder if that's what's going on here in this story, that Jesus is saying, you can do it. I have faith in you. Why do you have such little faith? You can live this kind of life that you see me living, and which is causing you to cry out to me. Let's just jump on to the final story here, Greg, because we're a little short on time here. So we're going to drop down to that last bullet, and then we'll just sort of sum up. So this is later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. Sea of Galilee again. Jesus is on the land. The disciples are in a boat on the sea. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. There's that verse that I was mentioning earlier. All I'm going to say about this is that this point here where it says, it is I. Jesus' response to the disciples here is, it is I. In the Greek, it's ego eimi. It means I am. So Jesus is saying, take courage, I am. And again, I think the author of Mark here is alluding to divine qualities, because that's how the God of the Hebrews self-disclosed in the book of Exodus. And when Moses says, who are you? I am. So again, there's this sort of reference here to divine, Jesus embodying the divine life and actually inviting us into that. Now, in the discussion questions, there's some more questions about this passage. I encourage you to look at that, but we're going to wrap up here. And so what can we say about what we've read in these two stories? One a little bit more detail than the other. I think what we see here is Jesus, as I was saying, embodying the divine life. There's a little part in chapter 1 where Jesus goes off into the wilderness to be tempted. In Matthew's gospel, we get way more detail about that. But it just says that he went into the wilderness, was tempted by the devil. And then it says, and he was with the wild animals and angels that attended him. So I think symbolic language, but you get this sense that Jesus has kind of mastered the wild side of his personality, if you like, or the wild side of being. And he's this centered, conscious person who can then go out and really bring peace to all kinds of situations. Because he's operating out of a place of peace, he can bring peace. He can take on chaotic forces. He can take on evil powers. He can take on oppression. He can take on sickness and darkness and evil in all its different forms. And he does that out of this sense of centeredness and peace at his core. And not only that, Jesus invites us into that life. We could live that way. The Buddha said it like this. Maybe we can put that quote up. Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. Now, I don't think that means don't be a peacemaker in the world and in our lives, but rather the fact that we can only really find personal peace by dealing with ourselves, dealing with our own demons, dealing with our own sickness, dealing with our own brokenness, and living out of a center that's centered on love in the way that Jesus did. And then we can come into all kinds of situations and bring peace. And it doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean like Jesus actually, from that place of peace, asleep in the boat, gets up and is angry. He's angry at the chaos and speaks to the waves. And he's kind of a little bit angry at the disciples. When he says, peace be still, I think there's some ambiguity there as well. It's peace be still. He says it to the waves, but he's kind of saying it to the disciples as well. Jesus is perhaps saying it to us too. And I don't know about you, but I know for me, I easily get off center. I easily get distracted where I'm not operating out of a place of peace on the inside. I'm trying to deal with the chaos around me. And what people think about me. I think we all probably struggle with this to some degree. We're operating out here. We're operating at the level of what does this person think about me? What are they going to do if I say this? We're engaging with criticism, competition, conflict, and we're sort of managing out there, and it's chaos, and we just get sucked into the chaos. Because it's just collective chaos, collective emotional chaos, rather than being able to operate out of a centered place of peace, where we can actually, that emotional chaos is your emotional chaos, it's not mine. And I can engage with it and try and help, but I'm going to do that from a place of peace rather than a place of chaos and just chaos upon chaos. I think likewise when we think about the chaos of the world and the violence and oppression that we see around, even locally, but especially globally, this is just chaos upon chaos. Something violent and evil and hateful happens, and then there's a chaotic response that wants to overwhelm that, and then there's a chaotic response back. And when you look back historically, the people that have been able to bring significant peace through non-violence all seem to have this quality of centeredness, of peace about them. And then they can speak with righteous anger to situations and take action in situations, but they're not dragged out of that peaceful center of love, non-violence, into retaliation and tit for tat and all that kind of stuff. And this is the way of Jesus. This is what Jesus is teaching us. So what we're going to do now to wrap up, and maybe the band could come up, so we're going to do a final song. We're just going to take a moment to have a centering meditation. It's something we've done here, I think, multiple times. There's a verse in Psalm 46. We were reading from the Psalms earlier. A verse in 46 that says, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still and know that I am God. Even when we think God's asleep, awake, absent, disappeared, and we want to cry out, perhaps we should go inward to our own perception of God's presence, God's perception of peace. So we're just going to close our eyes for a moment. Maybe we could put the lights down, Greg, and still our hearts. Let's focus on our breathing just to center ourselves physically. Breathe in and out. Feel the rhythm of your breath. And I'm going to say that verse, and then we're going to just literally center that verse bit by bit. So I'll say the verse, we'll have silence, then I'll say it again in silence, and so on. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. Okay, let's stand together and sing our last song.
In the colors, in the moment of our wilderness, blow our minds with love unfathomed, fill us with your breath, with your breath. When our hearts begin to tremble, when our hearts begin to swim, won't you whisper to us? It's your spend each moment. Why ever closer to the